April 1945. The war is almost over, but no one in this small German town knows exactly when it will end for them. The sky is the color of ash. Roofs are torn open like old wounds. A church steeple leans at an angle, bell silent, its stones scarred black by fire. In the narrow street below, broken glass crunches under the last retreating trucks of a shattered army. In the doorway of a half-collapsed house, a teenage girl stands very still. Her coat is too thin for the cold. One hand grips the doorframe for balance, the other rests on the curve of her swollen belly. She is 17. The child is due within weeks. The father is a German soldier who vanished with his unit 3 days ago, heading east or south or nowhere at all. No one told her. From far down the road comes a new sound, the heavy clatter of tank tracks on cobblestones, the low growl of unfamiliar engines. The Americans. Her teachers, posters, and radio programs have described them as ruthless invaders, violators, destroyers. Now they are only minutes away and there is nowhere left to run. To understand how a girl raised in that world reached this exact moment, abandoned by her own side, terrified of the enemy rolling toward her street, we need to step back into the collapsing heart of Nazi Germany. By the spring of 1945, the map of Europe no longer resembled the one drawn in German school textbooks at the start of the war. 9 months earlier, in June 1944, Allied soldiers had forced their way ashore on the beaches of Normandy. The landings that Hitler's generals had sworn to repel had succeeded. Within weeks, the bocage hedgerows of northern France became killing grounds as American, British, and Canadian units pushed inland, slowly but relentlessly. By August, Paris was free. By autumn, the Western Front pressed against Germany's own borders. In the east, the Red Army was devouring territory at an even faster pace. Since the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in 1943 and the collapse at Kursk that summer, German forces had been driven back mile by mile. In January 1945, Soviet armies launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. In a matter of weeks, they surged across Poland, smashed through the last coherent German defenses, and reached the Oder River, barely 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany, which had once boasted of conquering a continent, was now being squeezed to breaking point from both sides. From the air, the destruction was nearly total. British Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force flew wave after wave of missions. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Dresden, and dozens of other cities were pounded into ruins. Firestorms swallowed entire districts. In many towns, streets were lined not with houses but with jagged walls, blackened chimneys, and cellars that had become permanent homes. For civilians, especially in the West, the war was no longer an abstract enterprise announced in triumphant radio bulletins. It was overhead every night in the wail of sirens and the thunder of bombs. Children slept in bunkers and basements. Elderly people who remembered the First World War said they had never seen anything like this. The young had known nothing else. A German girl born in 1927 or 1928 had grown up entirely under Nazi rule. Her childhood had been shaped by parades, flags, Hitler youth camps, school lessons about race and destiny. In the League of German Girls, she had been taught that her highest duty was to be a healthy mother for the Reich. Posters showed radiant blonde women holding bobbies beneath soaring eagles. Magazines praised the heroic fertility of women who bore many children for the nation. Reality, as always, was more complicated. Families struggled with rationing and shortages long before defeat loomed. As the war dragged on, men vanished to the front, and the proportion of women in factories, farms, and offices soared. Teenagers took jobs vacated by older workers. Many were sent to the countryside as part of labor programs. Others helped dig anti-tank ditches or clear bomb damage. Amid this strain, relationships formed quickly. Soldiers came home on short leave, sometimes from the Eastern Front, hollow-eyed and desperate for warmth, for any moment that did not involve mud, fear, and death. Encounters that might once have stretched into cautious courtship were compressed into days, even hours, before the next transport departed. By 1943 and 1944, pregnancies that did not fit the official heroic narrative were increasingly common. Some were within marriages accelerated by war, others were not. The regime tolerated, even encouraged, births among racially acceptable women, whether married or not, but local society could be cruel. A visibly pregnant unmarried girl might find herself whispered about in the queue at the bakery, stared at in church, scolded by older neighbors who clung to pre-war notions of honor and shame. Yet the party line remained unyielding on one point: loyalty to the Führer and the war effort was non-negotiable. Even in the last months, when food ran low and bomb shelters were overcrowded, propaganda urged people to endure. Newspapers thundered about miracle weapons and final victories, and above all, they painted a monstrous picture of the enemy. On the eastern horizon, that was not entirely an invention. As the Red Army crossed into East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, reports, some exaggerated, others precisely accurate, filtered west. Tales of mass rapes, looting, and revenge spread through refugee columns. Women with small children fled westward in the dead of winter, pushing handcarts through snow, dodging both Soviet troops and German officers who still threatened to shoot anyone accused of deserting their homes. In the West, the picture of the enemy was different but no less distorted. The United States and Britain were depicted in broadcasts and posters as puppets of Jews and capitalists, fielding armies of criminals, black soldiers, and colonial savages who would ravage German women and destroy German culture. School teachers repeated these warnings. Party officials held lectures reminding communities what would happen if the front collapsed here in their own district. For a 17-year-old girl in a small town near the Rhine or in central Germany, this was the world she inhabited in 1944 and early 1945. Bombs, rumors, shortages, wrapped in an ideology that promised meaning, order, and ultimate redemption, even as that promise visibly failed. Then in September and October 1944, American troops breached the German border at places like Aachen, the first German city to fall. In December, Hitler launched a final counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. For a few weeks it seemed as if the tide might somehow turn. But by January 1945, the last reserves had been spent. The Bulge collapsed. The Western Allies resumed their advance. In many German towns, the change was first felt in the composition of the traffic on the roads. Columns of Wehrmacht trucks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery pieces, and marching infantry began moving not east but west and south, trying to escape encirclement. Field hospitals packed their stretchers and moved hurriedly. Administration offices burned papers. Party officials disappeared. Volkssturm units, hastily assembled militias of old men and boys, were told to hold crossroads and villages to the last man. Few were capable of doing so. For civilians, including heavily pregnant women, there were no special trains, no organized evacuation convoys. The state that had once infiltrated every corner of life now had little left to offer but slogans. Our teenage girl, like thousands of others, would have watched these movements with a mixture of confusion and dread. Soldiers streaming through, promises that the town would be defended, then suddenly orders to withdraw, leaving behind only a sprinkling of local police, elderly militia, and families who had nowhere to go. On maps in Allied headquarters, these places became grid squares and objectives to be taken on schedule. For the people inside them, they became silent traps, sitting in the path of an army they had been taught to fear from childhood. For the Western Allies, those traps had names. Towns like Remagen, Koblenz, Kassel, Fulda, countless villages dotting the Rhine plains and central German hills. By late 1944, the Western campaign had a clear momentum. In October, after brutal street fighting, American forces seized Aachen, the first major German city to fall. It was a psychological shock for both sides. For the Allies, it confirmed that the Siegfried Line could be pierced. For Germans, it proved that the war had truly reached home. Winter fighting in the Huichen Forest and then the Battle of the Bulge slowed the Allied timetable, but did not reverse it. Once the snow melted and the ruined Ardennes villages were cleared, the advance resumed with even greater force. In March 1945, the Americans seized a near-miracle opportunity. German engineers failed to demolish the bridge at Remagen in time. U.S. troops stormed across the Ludendorff Bridge and held it. Within days, a bridgehead existed on the east bank of the Rhine, the barrier that Hitler had promised would be impassable. Elsewhere, British and American engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river, supported by massive artillery barrages. Entire armored divisions rolled over these temporary structures. Behind them came the columns of support units that make modern warfare possible. Supply trucks, maintenance teams, field kitchens, medical detachments, military police, and the specialists of civil affairs, trained to manage conquered territories. On battle maps, the plan seemed precise. Armored and infantry divisions fanned out, cutting German communications, surrounding the Ruhr industrial area, then driving into the heart of the country. Arrows converged on key road junctions and rail hubs. What those arrows did not show were the people still in the way. Inside the collapsing Reich, Nazi propaganda worked overtime to influence what civilians expected from the oncoming Western Allies. Radio broadcasts described American and British soldiers as plunderers and violators. Pamphlets warned that Negro troops and criminals would be unleashed on German women. Posters urged civilians to fight to the last or face a future of slavery and degradation. These messages had a cumulative effect. For a German teenager who had never traveled outside her region, who had perhaps never met a foreigner, the image of the American was monstrous and vague at once, coarse, violent, racially mixed, driven by hatred of everything German. The fact that US and British units routinely took prisoners, treated wounded enemies, and maintained discipline was never mentioned. In Allied headquarters, the view of German civilians was more layered. General Eisenhower and his staff were planning not just the defeat of the Wehrmacht, but the occupation of Germany itself. They understood that millions of civilians would soon be under their control. The Geneva Conventions laid out clear rules. Civilians were to be protected from violence and unnecessary suffering. Collective reprisals were forbidden. Food and medical care had to be provided as far as possible. At the same time, there was deep anger. Reports of concentration camps, forced labor, and massacres had reached Allied commanders long before they saw those sights with their own eyes. Many believed that the German population bore responsibility for Nazi crimes. In Washington and London, policymakers debated how harshly to treat the defeated nation. Early drafts for occupation policy, like the directive that would become known as JCS 1067, emphasized dismantling German industry, purging Nazis from public life, and preventing any early recovery that might support another war. In the field, this translated into a hard, suspicious approach. Orders issued in late 1944 and early 1945 instructed American troops not to fraternize with German civilians. No friendly chatting, no social visits, no gifts, no romantic relationships. The idea was to maintain a visible line between victor and vanquished, and to keep morale and discipline from being eroded by personal ties. Germans were to be respected as human beings, but not treated as friends. Yet war zones rarely conform neatly to policy. An infantry company entering a German town in March or April 1945 did so under fire or expecting it. Houses had to be cleared quickly. Windows watched for snipers. Basements might conceal Volkssturm fighters or retreating soldiers. Troops kicked in doors, shouted orders, and herded residents into streets or common areas to be searched and checked. What they actually found again and again were the same patterns: fearful old people, mothers with small children, a scattering of wounded or sick, faces thin from rationing, hands raised not in salute but in surrender. Among these were always people like our pregnant teenager. For her, the sound of approaching engines and boots summoned every nightmare image the propaganda had planted. That fear was sharpened by stories drifting in from the east, of what had happened when Soviet units entered villages and cities. The Western Allies were different powers with different policies, but she had no reason to make that distinction. She knew only that the men coming down her street wore foreign uniforms and carried weapons. For the American soldiers, meanwhile, what they saw often did not match the fiery image of the enemy broadcast back home. After months of fighting through hedgerows, forests, and fortified towns, they now walked into places where the only resistance was a white sheet hanging from a window or a strip of cloth tied to a broomstick. The enemy greeted them not with grenades but with terrified silence. Civil affairs officers and military government detachments followed closely behind the lead battalions. Their job was to re-establish some kind of order, appoint temporary mayors, reopen water supplies, secure food stocks, and prevent epidemics. They were also responsible for dealing with the most vulnerable: orphans, the elderly, the sick and injured, and women whose pregnancies or recent births made them particularly fragile in a landscape of rubble and scarcity. Officially, compassion had to operate inside the fencing of non-fraternization and limited resources. Unofficially, it depended heavily on individual initiative. A company medic who encountered a woman in labor might improvise an aid station in a half-destroyed house, using whatever supplies he had. A lieutenant could order a guard detail to protect a building where women and children were gathered, not just against any of his own undisciplined men, but against desperate looters. A civil affairs captain might requisition a bakery, then ensure that some of its output went not only to U.S. mess halls but to feeding infants and expectant mothers, contrary to the cold logic that all calories should sustain occupying troops first. On paper, the armies were vast, mechanized instruments moving toward unconditional surrender. In reality, at the level of one ruined street, one cellar, one frightened girl, the future would turn on the small choices made in those first moments when the enemy stepped through the door. And it is through those human angles that we can best understand what happened when a retreating army left someone like her behind, and the Americans became, unexpectedly, her protectors. In the last weeks of the war, a girl in her late teens carried more than just the weight of her unborn child. She carried the weight of judgment. In a society that had preached female duty as motherhood for the nation, an unmarried pregnant girl stood at an awkward crossroads between ideology and custom. National Socialist propaganda praised German mothers in the abstract, but village morality, church teaching and family expectations still marked her as someone who had stepped outside acceptable lines, especially if the father had vanished. She might have met him at a dance organized for soldiers on leave or in a canteen or simply through neighbors. Perhaps he had promised to come back after the war or said nothing at all. Perhaps he had been gentle, perhaps he had been drunk and insistent. Whatever the path, the outcome now showed under her dress and everyone could see it. By early 1945, such stories were not rare. War had loosened restraints, brought strangers together for a few nights between marches and severed the usual frameworks of family, work, and community. Yet the shame fell almost entirely on the woman. Older women muttered about propriety. Some men looked away, others joked crudely. For a young girl, the interior tension could be unbearable. A mixture of love for the life growing inside her, fear of how she would feed it, and a gnawing question about what kind of world that child would enter. That question was sharpened with every report from the front, every air raid, every rumor that the Americans are close. Her pregnancy made her both vulnerable and, in a fragile way, central. Neighbors might bring an extra potato, a bit of bread, a scrap of cloth for baby clothes, even while shaking their heads. The local party official might see her only as another number in the birth statistics, but the retreating army saw little at all. When German field units pulled out of towns ahead of the Allied advance, they did so with one overriding goal: survival. Officers had orders to preserve combat strength, avoid encirclement, and find some new defensible line where they could delay the inevitable collapse. They had too few trucks, too little fuel, and too many wounded to move. Columns snarled endlessly on roads choked with retreating soldiers, scattered pieces of broken divisions, and refugee streams heading west. Civilians, unless they were needed for urgent work, were told to stay put. Transporting them in numbers was logistically impossible. Allowing them to swarm along army routes risked blocking movements, drawing enemy air attacks, and spreading panic. In some areas, party officials threatened punishment for anyone who attempted to flee without authorization, still clinging to the idea that holding firm would somehow bring victory or honorable death. In practice, that meant that hospitals, nursing homes, orphanages, and private homes with the least mobile residents, women in advanced pregnancy among them, were simply left behind. A local doctor might press a departing officer to take a few critical cases in an ambulance. A sympathetic sergeant might hastily leave behind a crate of canned goods, but these were exceptions. The average infantry or armored unit rolled through and out, leaving the civilian fabric to face what came next. On the maps carried by German officers, the town became just another point to be abandoned on schedule. For the pregnant teenager watching the last troop lorries disappear, it was a severing of her last visible tie to the man who had fathered her child, and to the sense, however fragile, that her fate was still bound up with the fortunes of the army. Then another kind of map took over, the laminated situation maps in American command posts, where her town was marked as an objective to seize, clear, and pass through. The American soldiers who would do that clearing carried their own burdens. Most GIs pushing into Germany in March and April 1945 had already endured months, sometimes years, of combat. Many had fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, or the Ardennes. They had seen friends killed by artillery, mines, and snipers. Their image of the German had been shaped by those experiences: efficient, stubborn, skilled at ambush and defense. At the same time, they had been briefed about what their governments now knew of Nazi crimes. As units overran camps and labor sites, the rumors hardened into horrifying reality. Some soldiers walked through places like Buchenwald, Dora-Mittelbau, or Ohrdruf and came away with a searing conviction that Germans, collectively, bore guilt. Against that background, the non-fraternization orders seemed sensible to many officers. Distance meant safety, moral, physical, and disciplinary. No trading, no socializing, no blurring of roles between occupier and occupied. Yet when riflemen kicked open doors in these small towns and shouted for the occupants to come out with their hands up, the first people they saw were seldom party officials or SS men. More often they found trembling grandmothers, confused small children, and women whose bodies plainly showed the late stages of pregnancy. In memoir after memoir, American medics and chaplains recall these scenes: a girl half-collapsed on a cellar step, labor starting early from shock and exhaustion; a woman hurried into an improvised aid station while artillery still rumbled at the edge of town; a newborn wrapped in a torn curtain because there were no blankets left. Regulations did not disappear in those moments, but they bent. A GI could ignore a hungry child, insist that rations were for soldiers only. Some did, scarcity and fatigue blunt compassion. Others, remembering their own sisters, girlfriends, or wives back home, quietly passed a chocolate bar or a can of condensed milk into a waiting hand. Medics summoned by shouted corpsmen would kneel beside an enemy civilian just as they would beside a comrade, checking pulse and breathing, doing what they could with morphine, bandages, and basic obstetric knowledge. Officers found themselves drawing new lines on the fly, forbidding their men from lingering in German houses but ordering guards to prevent anyone from harming the most vulnerable, enforcing curfews but making exceptions for those seeking a doctor in the night. The Manual of the Laws of War gave a framework: conscience, habit, and the memory of life before the uniform filled in the rest. For a pregnant teenager huddled in the shell of her home, the difference between two interpretations of those rules, the cold, distant one and the more humane one, would spell the difference between terror and a fragile, unexpected sense of safety. Behind every small act of kindness or indifference stood a web of policies, memoranda, and directives written far from the ruined streets. By the time American soldiers crossed the Rhine, Allied planners had been debating for months how to treat the defeated Germany. In Washington, the directive that would later be known as JCS 1067 took shape, emphasizing that the occupying forces should not take responsibility for economic rehabilitation beyond preventing disease and unrest. Germany was not to be coddled back to health. In the field, this general hardness translated into clear, immediate orders on personal conduct. As early as September 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued instructions forbidding fraternization with German civilians. Soldiers were not to visit German homes socially, accept invitations, or form romantic relationships. Smiling, chatting, giving gifts, acts that humanized the enemy, were discouraged or banned. The hoped-for effect was to keep morale focused, maintain discipline, and avoid the messy complications of close contact. But war has a way of exposing the limits of paper rules. Once American units rolled into German towns, the boundary between contact and fraternization blurred. A military government officer interviewing a local doctor to assess medical needs might spend hours in the same building, listening to stories of bombings and shortages. MPs assigned to guard a ration depot saw the same faces day after day at the edge of the queue. A medic tending a woman in labor could hardly refuse to speak to her or to soothe a crying child. The ban on fraternization remained on the books, and violations could bring punishment. Yet commanding officers soon recognized that a rigid, inhuman application of the rule could worsen chaos. They needed cooperation from mayors, police, and utility workers to keep towns functioning. They needed civilians calm, not panicked. In many areas, the letter of the law softened even before it was officially relaxed later in 1945. The result was an occupation shaped as much by the character of individual officers and NCOs as by the text of directives. Some clung to distance and suspicion. Others, within broad limits, allowed acts of compassion. For a girl whose world had shrunk to the room where she waited for her child, those individual decisions, not memoranda in a distant capital, defined what the enemy would be to her. For both sides, reality soon collided with the images they had carried into this confrontation. The pregnant teenager had grown up hearing that foreign soldiers were embodiments of danger. In schoolbooks, the American was portrayed as crude, materialistic, racially mixed, hostile to everything German. On the radio, she had heard that enemy armies would trample the innocent, violate women, and raze towns indiscriminately. These warnings were often deliberately sharpened with stories of atrocities committed elsewhere, especially in the East, and subtly encouraged fear-driven obedience. Better to endure hardship under your own regime than to fall into alien hands. The American soldier, for his part, had his own enemy image. Training films and propaganda posters depicted Germans alternately as faceless Sturmtrupps under Hitler's spell and as treacherous, dangerous opponents. Letters from home urged him to remember Pearl Harbor, to fight ruthlessly to avenge fallen comrades. Reports of concentration camps and murdered civilians inflamed anger. Even while commanders stressed that the war was against Nazism rather than all Germans, many GIs arrived at the border believing they were about to step into a hostile land filled with willing accomplices of the regime. Then the door opened and they saw each other. For the girl, the first glimpse of American troops, the way they moved, spoke, checked rooms, handled their weapons, either confirmed her nightmares or began to dismantle them. If a soldier shouted but did not strike, if he kept his distance, if he signaled her to stay seated because of her condition, the harsh image she had been fed started to crack. The sight of a medic kneeling by a wounded neighbor or of a guard posted outside a house where women and children sheltered could upend years of indoctrination in a single afternoon. For the GI, stepping into a dim cellar and finding a young woman clutching her belly, eyes wide with animal fear, shifted something as well. The abstract Kraut became a very specific human being, someone whose terror went beyond the normal fear of gunfire, someone about to bring a life into the world in the middle of devastation. The enemy now had a face that echoed sisters and girlfriends photographed in wallets back home. In these charged moments, the grand designs of nations faded. A simple question emerged: how far in the midst of ruin would each person let the idea of enemy dictate their actions? Beyond the immediate encounter, there were longer shadows that would stretch into the post-war years. Defeat in 1945 fell unevenly across German society, and it was often women who bore the heaviest, most intimate burdens. As the front collapsed, many men were killed, captured, or simply disappeared into the chaos of retreat. Widows, wives of prisoners of war, and women whose relationships had never been formally recognized were left to care for children alone. Housing was scarce, food was scarcer. In this environment, the line between social protection and social condemnation could be thin. Communities, clinging to shattered notions of respectability, frequently judged women more harshly than men. A girl pregnant by a German soldier who had fallen at the front might be puttied, her child embraced as a symbol of sacrifice. A girl abandoned by a lover who survived but did not return could find herself trapped between longing and resentment. Those perceived to have sought or accepted help from the occupiers, extra rations, a place to stay, medical care, risked whispers of betrayal. In the years that followed, occupation children, fathered by Allied soldiers, would face their own stigmas. But even those whose fathers were German often grew up in an atmosphere thick with unspoken stories. Rumors of who had taken in lodgers, who had worked for the military government, who had been seen talking to American MPs on a street corner. Shame, pride, necessity, and survival braided together in ways that official histories often overlooked. Many women carried these memories silently. Interviews conducted decades later reveal how rarely they spoke, even to their own children, about the fear of those last days of war, the loneliness of pregnancy without a husband, and the shock of finding protection from men they had been told were monsters. It was easier for a long time to fold those experiences into a more general narrative of suffering and recovery, to talk about hunger and cold rather than about the night a foreign soldier stood in a doorway to make sure no harm came to them. Yet it is precisely in these small, intimate events that we see the deepest impact of 1945, not just on borders and governments, but on the texture of private lives. In one ruined town, in one house with a cracked doorway and dust sifting from the ceiling, all these forces, doctrine, propaganda, gender roles, and individual conscience, would collide at the instant when the last German truck rolled away and the first American tank turned the corner. Dawn comes gray and thin over the town. The night has been full of movement, the growl of truck engines, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the shouted commands of men trying to coordinate a retreat in darkness. By first light, those sounds fade. The last Wehrmacht vehicles rattle over the bridge at the edge of town, then disappear into the mist. What remains is a silence that does not feel like peace. In the main street, shutters hang askew, shop signs sway in the cold wind. The cobblestones are scarred by blast marks and churned by tank tracks from units that passed through days earlier. Here and there, white cloths already hang from upstairs windows, improvised flags of surrender, sheets and tablecloths tied to broom handles. In one battered house, the teenage girl we have been following stands just long enough in the doorway to see the rear of the last German truck vanish around a corner. Then a sharp contraction grips her abdomen and she retreats into the half-collapsed hallway, one hand pressed to the wall for balance. Her belly is heavy. The calculated due date is close now. Stress, malnutrition, and fear may shift it sooner. The father, a soldier in a unit that no longer exists intact, has left nothing behind but a memory and perhaps a few letters folded in a drawer. The state, which once claimed every aspect of her life, has left her here with no transport, no plan, and no protection. Further along the street, people begin to appear at windows, cautious, eyes narrowed. The rumor passed from doorway to doorway is simple and terrifying: the Americans are near. Some whisper of resistance, most know there are hardly any armed men left. Shortly after mid-morning, distant sounds confirm the reports. From beyond the town comes the dull thump of artillery, the distinct metallic clank of tank tracks over hard ground, the rising murmur of engines. The noise grows until it fills the air, rattling loose plaster from ceilings, sending small avalanches of dust down brickwork in already damaged houses. Forward elements of an American infantry division, supported by armor, are advancing along the road network. The town ahead is marked as an objective to be seized and cleared, a point in a broader operation designed to encircle remaining German forces and push deeper into the country's interior. For the men in the lead tanks, this is one more place on a long, bloody route that began in Normandy or even earlier. They have been briefed about possible resistance, isolated machine gun nests, snipers in church towers, demolitions on main roads. The pattern of the last weeks has been uneven. Some towns fought hard, others surrendered without a shot. As the armored column approaches the outskirts, the guns elevate, scanning. Infantry riding on the tanks' hulls jump down and fan out. The first white flags come into view, bed linen and tablecloths drooping from upper stories, a universal signal understood in all languages. The order is to proceed, but cautiously. Shells, if they come, will come now. They do not. A few scattered cracks of rifle fire from the far side of town are answered with brief, overwhelming bursts from American machine guns. Then even those sounds die. Whatever defenders remained have either been killed, captured, or melted away. The tanks grind into the town center at a walking pace, turrets traversing, steel tracks chewing the cobblestones. Behind them, rifles at the ready, small groups of infantry peel off into side streets. Their job is to clear each building, eliminate any pockets of resistance, and secure the area for the follow-on units that will bring in radios, supply trucks, and command posts. Doors are kicked in, boots pound up staircases, basements are checked. In some houses, soldiers find only emptiness and dust. In others, they find civilians assembled in common rooms and cellars, old men, women, children, a few wounded in bandages improvised from torn sheets. It is in one such cellar, in one such town, that fortunes cross. A squad descends a narrow staircase, weapons pointed down, eyes straining to adjust from bright daylight to the dim tunnel-like space beneath the house. The air is cool and stale, thick with coal dust, cooking smoke, and the sour tang of unwashed clothes. A single oil lamp throws a small yellow circle over a cluster of faces huddled together on benches and crates. Hands go up, the universal gesture. Among them is the girl. Her posture gives her away immediately. She half rises, instinctively trying to stand with the others, then sinks back, hand pressed to her abdomen. Her dress strains tight over her belly. Sweat beads her forehead despite the chill. Another contraction tightens her features and she closes her eyes, breathing shallowly. The soldier's initial tension, trigger fingers tight, bodies poised for sudden violence, shifts 1 degree, training takes over. One man covers, another steps forward to scan for weapons. A few words are exchanged with those who speak a little German or with the aid of hand signals. Are there soldiers here? Any guns? Any mines? None are found. What happens next, in dozens of documented cases like this, follows a surprisingly consistent pattern. Once the space is declared secure, officers and NCOs who have seen this scene before make quick decisions. The civilians are told, by gestures if necessary, to remain in place until the house and the street are fully cleared to avoid stray fire or misunderstandings. A medic is called down the stairs. American medical personnel in 1945 were trained primarily to treat battlefield trauma, but many had picked up basic obstetric skills by necessity. Letters and post-war interviews describe medics delivering bobbies in barns, kitchens, and cellars across liberated and occupied Europe. One wrote home about cutting an umbilical cord with sterilized scissors while artillery rumbled outside. Another recalled fashioning a makeshift cradle from an ammunition crate. Here, as the medic crouches beside the girl, he notes pallor, signs of exhaustion, the rhythm of contractions. His supplies are limited: bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, perhaps a small amount of antiseptic, a stethoscope. Still, he can offer something crucial in this moment: attention, calm, a measure of skill. For the girl, every expectation she has carried about the Americans is now colliding with the evidence in front of her. These men in foreign uniforms are armed, dirty, tired. They speak a language she does not understand. One or two may throw quick, unreadable glances at her, but they do not beat her. They do not drag her away. Instead, they clear a little space around her on the cellar floor. One points firmly at the steps, indicating that others should give her room. The medic, rather than moving on, stays beside her, checking pulse, timing contractions, perhaps managing pain within the bounds of his orders. Around them, other civilians watch with a mixture of fear and disbelief. They too have heard stories, many true, of what invading armies can do to vulnerable populations. Some may have relatives in the East who fled from Soviet advances. To see enemy soldiers acting with restraint, even rough protectiveness, is a shock that ripples through the room. Above ground, the clearing operations continue. A church tower is searched for snipers. The town hall is inspected for booby traps. In the main square, a temporary command post is established near a fountain whose water is now tested to ensure it is safe to drink. As the hours pass, more American vehicles arrive, jeeps, half-tracks, trucks loaded with supplies and radio sets. By late afternoon, the shooting has stopped. A curfew is announced. Sentries are posted at key intersections. German policemen or officials, if they can be located and vetted, are summoned to account for public buildings, utilities, and remaining stocks of food. Underground, in that dim cellar, another process is unfolding on a different timescale. The slow, painful approach of birth in a place never meant to serve as a maternity ward. The immediate shock of the town's capture is over. The next phase, occupation, governance, and the fragile business of survival, begins for both the conquerors and the conquered. And in the space between those two phases, in the first 24 hours after the Americans enter, that girl's understanding of who is enemy and who is protector will be permanently altered. Night settles early over the occupied town. Lanterns are extinguished or shaded, windows stay dark. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks once, then falls silent. The curfew is in force. On the main street, the outlines of American sentries stand in doorways and at corners, rifles slung, helmets just visible against the pallid sky. In the cellar, hours have blurred. Time is measured now by the rhythm of the girl's contractions, by the ebb and flow of pain. The medic has sent a runner to fetch additional supplies from the battalion aid station. In many documented cases, such requests included blankets, clean cloth, and whatever stimulants or pain relief could be spared. In wartime, childbirth is both entirely ordinary and extraordinarily fragile. Everywhere on the continent in 1945, women labored in farmhouses, bunkers, and bomb shelters. Some, like this girl, did so with only strangers around them. Others were attended by mudwivas who had delivered half the town. What makes this scene distinctive is not the act itself, but who is present to help keep mother and child alive. An American soldier, thousands of kilometers from home, wearing a uniform she once saw as the emblem of nightmare, now checks her breathing and speaks words she cannot understand, but whose tone is unmistakably meant to steady and reassure. Around him, other troops enforce a kind of improvised perimeter, not a ring of sandbags and wire, but a zone of relative safety maintained by their mere presence. Outside the cellar stairs, an MP stands watch at the entrance to the building. His primary orders concern security and discipline. No unauthorized movement, no looting, no uncontrolled contact between troops and civilians. Yet the very fact that he is there, visible, armed, responsible, means that no one can easily push their way in to take advantage of the chaos. In many towns, records show that American commanders specifically ordered guards placed at locations where vulnerable civilians were gathered, makeshift hospitals, churches, and assembly points. The same logic extends here, even if no one writes it down. By morning, the girl's ordeal reaches its peak. News spreads in the crowded cellar. Labor has begun in earnest. For some, this is a welcome distraction from the larger catastrophe engulfing their world. For others, it is a reminder that life continues its own cycles regardless of who holds power above ground. In the cramped light, with improvised linens and whatever sterile equipment can be mustered, a new life enters a conquered town. Scenes like this appear in multiple Allied and German post-war accounts. Bobbies born at the edge of battle, mothers too weak from hunger, physicians improvising with almost no resources, and foreign medics joining or taking the place of local mudwivas. Sometimes the child lived, sometimes it did not. But in many of these testimonies, American medical staff did what they could, cutting cords, checking vital signs, advising rest and hydration, arranging, if possible, for the mother to be moved to a less dangerous location. Later, when the girl is moved, helped carefully up the cellar steps into watery daylight, the full transformation of the town becomes apparent. The square where party rallies were once held now hosts parked jeeps and command vehicles. A makeshift sign marks the headquarters of the local military government. Nearby, a school building has been requisitioned as an aid station, its chalkboards still bearing the last lessons in faded white script. Classrooms serve as wards, desks are shoved aside to make room for stretchers. Here, American medics and a few remaining German doctors and nurses work side by side. Officially, military hospitals exist for soldiers first, but U.S. Army records from occupied zones in Germany show that civilians, especially women and children, were often treated when capacity allowed. Shot civilians caught in crossfire, victims of bomb blasts, and women in labor sometimes lay in the same corridors as wounded GIs. The girl is one among many. Her baby, if alive and breathing, joins the small chorus of cries echoing off plaster walls. Military government officers take note of such cases, sometimes recording them as part of their reports on local conditions, numbers of sick, births, deaths. In certain areas, occupation authorities instruct local administrations to prioritize milk and fat rations for infants and nursing mothers. It is not generosity so much as a recognition that epidemics and mass infant mortality would destabilize already fragile communities. In the temporary order that forms, the Americans become more than just conquerors. They are now the effective government, the regulators of food, movement, and security. The girl's experience of them narrows to very concrete points. The GI who carried her up the stairs, the medic who checked on her in the improvised ward, the guard who turned away a curious or drunken soldier at the door. Acts like these are not motivated by affection. They are products of training, discipline, and often personal decency. Yet for her, they mark a complete inversion of the story she's been told for years. The enemy she feared has become the structure within which she and her child might survive. Around her, the town adjusts rapidly to the new reality. German officials, purged of obvious Nazi party members when possible, are pressed into service to restore water and electricity. Bakers are ordered to light their ovens again using flour requisitioned under American supervision. Warehouses are inventoried. What grain and preserved food remain are divided between military needs and minimum civilian rations. American units, bound by their own supply limitations and orders not to feed Germany, nevertheless find themselves intervening against outright starvation. Documents and photographs show soldiers handing out K-rations to children, organizing soup kitchens with the help of local volunteers, and ensuring that relief agencies, when they arrive, can operate safely. In this fluid situation, the protection the teenage mother receives is both specific and part of a larger pattern. She is not singled out in reports. No officer writes a memo titled with her name. Yet the structures set up in those days, the guarded aid station, the ration lines, the curfews that reduce random violence at night, the clear orders against rape and assault, create a space in which she, an abandoned civilian of the defeated side, can heal enough to care for her newborn. For the Americans, her presence is one thread in a tangled tapestry of responsibilities. They must hunt for any remaining armed SS units, prevent sabotage, process prisoners of war, and deal with displaced persons from half a dozen countries. They are exhausted. Some are hardened to suffering, others are deeply affected by it. They operate under orders written with strategic goals in mind, but on the ground they are constantly forced to decide what, in a given moment, it means to balance victory with humanity. For her, the meaning of this moment will extend far beyond the day the last American patrol leaves the town. Years later, if she tells the story at all, certain images will stand out. The sound of retreating German engines fatting into distance, the first sight of an American tank turret sliding past her window, the feel of rough foreign hands lifting her, not in violence but in practical care, the unexpected relief of hearing her child cry in a place she feared would only witness screams. Those images bridge the divide between enemy and protector in ways no speech or treaty could. They also lay the groundwork for a new, complicated relationship between Germans and Americans that will define much of the post-war era. When the official instruments of surrender are finally signed and the war in Europe formally ends, people like her will already be living in the world those signatures create. Their daily battles for food, shelter, recognition, and a future for their children will continue long after the last gun has fallen silent. And in the first chaotic months of peace, the legacy of that cellar, that birth, and that unexpected protection will begin to unfold. May 1945 arrives without fanfare in most German towns. There are no calendars on the walls anymore. Days blend into one another, marked only by the distribution of rations, the roll call of the missing, the slow drying of spring mud in craters and trenches. On the 8th of May, the German armed forces sign an unconditional surrender. For the Allies, it is Victory in Europe Day. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds pour into the streets, flags wave, bands play. For people in places like this bomb-scarred town, the news arrives as a murmur than a statement: the war is over. No one moves at first, then a very quiet, practical question rises everywhere at once. What now? For months already, the girl has been living in a reality that feels like a kind of limbo between war and peace. Her baby, born in that cellar or in the improvised aid station, is now a small, fragile presence that must be kept warm and fed. The cries that once startled her in the night now serve as a reassurance: the child is still alive. Hunger, however, is constant. Germany in 1945 is a landscape of scarcity. Bombing has damaged fields and transport. Fertilizer and machinery are lacking. Rail lines are broken. Millions of soldiers are prisoners of war. Millions more displaced persons, forced laborers from Poland, the Soviet Union, France, Italy, and elsewhere, are trying to go home, straining supply systems further. The occupation authorities calculate minimum rations. In many zones of Western Germany, civilians receive between 1,000 and 1,500 calories a day, sometimes less. Official figures, even when met, translate into real plates that feel empty. A thin slice of bread, watery soup, a rare spoonful of fat. Black markets flourish. People trade jewelry, furniture, and heirlooms for extra food. For a nursing mother, this is a dangerous equation. She needs calories she does not have. Her body, weakened by years of rationing and the stress of late war months, struggles to provide milk. The Americans, now the de facto government, are caught between hard policy and humanitarian realities. Their own soldiers must be fed adequately. At the same time, visible civilian starvation threatens unrest and disease. In response, military government officers authorize limited distributions targeted at the most vulnerable: children, the elderly, and in some areas, pregnant women and nursing mothers. German local administrations, under their supervision, draw up lists. There is resentment and jealousy. Some insist that everyone is hungry. Others recognize, despite their own emptiness, that those with infants face an especially sharp edge. Our young mother stands in these lines like everyone else. Her status is ambiguous. She's not a widow officially. There is no telegram confirming the father's death. She's not a wife with a husband in captivity, entitled to certain sympathies. She is a girl who loved or trusted a man in uniform and found herself alone with the outcome. Among the other women waiting for rations, there are many like her. Together, they form a quiet, unacknowledged constituency of the defeated war. The Americans who see them handing out powdered milk or checking ration cards cannot easily decode these nuances. To them, she is simply one German among many, thin, tired, carrying a baby wrapped in whatever cloth she could find. Some of the soldiers will rotate out of Germany soon, sent home or to other theaters. They will remember snapshots, the ruins, the queues, the hollow eyes of children. She will not rotate anywhere. Her battlefield is this rebuilt kitchen, this cracked courtyard where laundry hangs, this path to the town well. Hospitals such as they are struggle. In many regions, up to half of all medical buildings have been damaged or destroyed. Equipment is scarce, drugs are limited, doctors have been killed, drafted, or imprisoned. Those who remain must cope with everything at once: war wounds, infections, births, malnutrition, and the psychological trauma now emerging in patients who no longer have to focus all their energy on immediate survival. Infant mortality rates rise sharply in these years. Diarrheal illnesses, respiratory infections, and simple failure to thrive claim more bobbies than they would have in peacetime. Each small coffin in a churchyard tells a story that connects the grand strategies of war to their smallest, most unforgiving consequences. And yet there is resilience. Women form support networks almost by instinct. Neighbors share advice on stretching meager rations, mending clothes, and caring for infants with fevers. Those with a little more, perhaps a relative in the countryside who can send potatoes or a small ham, often quietly slip help to those with nothing. In this female world of post-war survival, the Americans exist at the edges as a set of rules and uniforms, vehicles and checkpoints. They can be a source of danger, but also of order and occasional relief. Over time, their presence becomes a familiar part of the town's sounds and sights. The rumble of trucks in the morning, the hum of generators, the clipped English commands exchanged on corners. For the girl, now a young mother, the most intimate memory of them remains rooted in that first encounter when the front passed through her town. The man who once crouched beside her in a cellar is long gone, perhaps already back in the United States trying to rebuild his own life. She does not know his name, he may never speak of her. In the ledger books of history, their contact is a blank line. But in the unrecorded narrative that lives inside her, those minutes or hours are central. The moment when the map of enemies and allies shifted, not on a wall in a command post, but in her mind. As months stretch into the first hard post-war winter, this inner map will slowly align with a wider political transformation that no one in 1945 can yet fully see. The occupation settles into something more structured as the months pass. Germany is divided into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Lines on maps harden into checkpoints on roads and signs at the edge of towns. In the American zone, where our young mother lives, the khaki uniforms become a permanent feature of the landscape. In the summer of 1945, Washington begins to rethink some of its earliest, harsher directives. The total ban on fraternization, which had proved awkward and in many cases unenforceable, is relaxed in stages. First, casual contact with children is permitted. Then conversation with adults is tolerated, so long as it does not involve political discussion or intimacy. Officially, romantic relationships remain forbidden. Unofficially, they begin to appear. On the streets of towns like hers, the change is visible. At first, children kept their distance from the foreign soldiers. They watched from behind skirts and doorframes. Gradually, curiosity overcomes fear. A GI produces a stick of chewing gum or a piece of chocolate. Eyes widen, word spreads. By autumn, knots of children follow patrols at a safe distance, mimicking English words, pointing at vehicles, laughing when a soldier waves. For the girl who once thought these men would be her destroyers, the transformation is disorienting. She pushes a pram along the same street where tanks rolled months before. The baby inside blinks at the light, fingers clenching and unclenching. An American truck passes slowly. One of the men in the back raises a hand in a brief, almost shy greeting. She nods back, uncertain, feeling the eyes of neighbors on her. The gesture is small, but it marks how far her world has shifted. The political currents beneath these daily encounters are shifting as well. By 1947, the harshest visions of permanent German weakness give way to a new strategic calculation. Tensions with the Soviet Union are rising. The Iron Curtain is descending across Europe. In Washington, policymakers recognize that a stable, economically viable West Germany will be essential as a partner and a buffer. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, begins to funnel aid into Western Europe. Food, raw materials, and machinery arrive, tied to requirements for cooperation and reform. In 1948, a currency reform replaces the nearly worthless Reichsmark with the Deutschmark in the Western zones, wiping out savings but stabilizing prices. Slowly, shop windows in towns like hers begin to display more than empty shelves and a few wilted vegetables. For ordinary people, the abstract language of economic policy becomes tangible in the clatter of construction sites and the smell of fresh bread. Rubble is cleared, new roofs rise where only beams once stood, factories restart with American-supplied equipment, ration levels inch upward, still meager but less desperate than in the first post-war winters. The baby she carried through the last months of war takes his first steps in courtyards no longer littered with broken glass. The Americans, once occupying conquerors, now appear increasingly as guarantors of order and sources of opportunity. Some German women form relationships with U.S. soldiers. Despite regulations and social disapproval, attachments deepen. Marriages are arranged, sometimes with considerable bureaucratic difficulty, and war brides emigrate to the United States. Children of these unions grow up straddling two identities, often marked by the color of their skin or their names. Alongside these sanctioned relationships are many others that remain in the shadows. Brief affairs, coerced encounters, and liaisons born of vulnerability and hunger as much as affection. The children who result, Amerikaner Kinder in colloquial German, encounter mixed reactions. Some are loved and defended by their mothers' families. Others face bullying and stigma, especially those who are visibly of mixed race. Many grow up with little or no information about their fathers, whose military records and movements are hard to trace. Our young mother watches these developments with a perspective shaped by her own experience. Her child is German, fathered by a soldier who wore the same uniform as the men who once marched out of the town and left her behind. She has no illusions about the moral clarity of sides. She knows kindness and abandonment, discipline and collapse can come from any color of cloth on a tunic. When neighbors whisper about girls who run after the armies, she understands the mix of envy, fear, and resentment in their voices, and the hard economic realities that sometimes underlie such choices. As West Germany takes shape in 1949, with the founding of the Federal Republic and its alignment with the Western Bloc, the presence of American troops becomes normalized. Bases grow on the outskirts of towns. New generations of soldiers arrive who have not experienced combat, but who serve now as a tripwire in the emerging Cold War. Behind barracks fences, they play baseball, listen to unfamiliar music, and live lives that seem distant and close at once. Memory in this environment becomes selective. Official narratives focus on Reconstruction, the economic miracle, and the integration of the Federal Republic into Western alliances like NATO. The darker aspects of the immediate post-war period, hunger, black markets, the vulnerability of women and children, recede from public discussion. Many women choose silence about 1945, about pregnancies in ruined houses, about the hands that helped or hurt them in the shadows of collapse. Our protagonist folds her story into that silence. She raises her child, finds work when the economy improves, perhaps marries later. She may tell her son or daughter about their father, the German soldier, in vague terms. The episode in the cellar, the presence of the American medic, the guarded doorway, these are memories she turns over privately, perhaps in the small hours when the house is quiet. Decades on, when former enemies stand side by side at commemorations, when American presidents speak in German cities about partnership and shared values, the official image of 1945 is one of transformation from conflict to alliance. The lived reality was grittier, more uncertain, shaped by human frailty and unexpected decency under extreme pressure. Somewhere in that spectrum lies the truth of a pregnant teenager abandoned by a retreating army and shocked to find that, in her most vulnerable hour, it was the enemy who kept her and her child from slipping into the void. History often records wars in the language of numbers. Divisions advanced, towns taken, casualties inflicted, conferences held, treaties signed. The story of 1945 is usually told in that register: total collapse, unconditional surrender, the birth of a new order. But underneath those sweeping phrases lay rooms like that cellar. A single figure in the half-dark, a girl not yet out of adolescence, strained by labor while the front rolled over her street. She did not choose the ideology that shaped her childhood. She did not draft the orders that sent men east and west. She did not design the propaganda that taught her to fear foreign uniforms more than the bombs that fell from the sky. She simply lived where she had been born, grew up under the symbols on the walls, and loved, or was used by, a man who wore the clothing of the state. When the system that claimed to protect her collapsed, it did so with stunning indifference to her fate. The army marched away, the bureaucracy vanished. The slogans meant nothing in the face of empty cupboards and approaching engines. The men who replaced them came as part of an opposing machine, another army, another hierarchy, another set of orders. They were capable of destruction on a scale no one in her town could fully grasp. Yet when they entered her house, the crucial decision was not taken in a distant headquarters. But in the few seconds it took for a soldier to lower his weapon, for a medic to kneel and open his bag, for an officer to post a guard at a door. In that narrow space between doctrine and instinct, between policy and conscience, the meaning of enemy shifted. Her story, repeated in different forms across Germany and across all wars, reminds us that the real frontier between cruelty and mercy does not run cleanly between nations or uniforms. It runs through each person who has power over another at a vulnerable moment. The child she carried stepped into a world built from the ruins of decisions made far beyond their sight. Yet the first proof that this world could contain not only violence but also restraint and care came from someone she had been taught to hate. In that sense, the smallest scene in a collapsing town illuminates the largest lesson, that even in the most organized, impersonal conflicts, the future is still shaped, at the most intimate level, by individual choices to either confirm or contradict the worst things we believe about each other.